Welcome back to the Space Salvi Institute podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin.
And I'm Bobby Mixa.
And today we have another great guest whose work we want to share with you. But before I introduce him, please do be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast, share your favorite episodes, and leave us a comment or ask us a question in the comments section of YouTube. It really helps draw attention to our work, and we really love to engage with you there. Now to introduce our guest. We are delighted to be joined today by Mark Hoipkemier, who is Assistant Research Professor in the Business, Ethics, and Society program at the University of Notre Dame. He has recently published a book that Bobby and I both enjoyed very much, which is called The Price of the Common Good, Markets, Corporations, and Political Economy. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, Mark, we were the ones who started kind of the dialogue, but I just wanted to just say that first of all, I encourage all our listeners to go out and get this book because it was such an eye opener for me. Like Andrew said, it's called The Price of the Common Good, and I thought maybe we just jump into the kind of nitty gritty of the things. For the last at least as long as I've lived, there's just been this kind of like normal way of thinking about markets and the economy that I've just assumed to be completely natural. But your book in some ways tells a little bit of a different story. So also being from Chicago, I remember the first time I read something like The Chicago Boys. It was about some thing going on in South America and those Chicago boys. I took a little pride not knowing much about, even though it was, they weren't really complimenting the Chicago boys, but I took some pride that, say, the Chicago School of Economics had some influence in the world. But your book really, in the way I read it, was really a kind of a response to that. So for our listeners, in maybe what we think is a completely natural way of thinking about finance, markets, and economy, can you describe a little bit what that Chicago school is, and then maybe get into a little bit of what your response to that may be?
Sure. Well, a bit of background about the book as a whole. I mean, the point of the book, or the goal of the book, is to apply the concept of the common good or concept of common goods to the economy, to help us understand things, how the economy works, and what would make it a better economy. And the way we normally think about our economy, and I think this is what you were just referencing, is something like it's in purely a zone of private interest. So there's a famous quote from Adam Smith who he says, when you buy things from the butcher or the brewer or the baker, it's not from his humanity or his altruism, it's just his private interest. And he wants to sell, you want to buy, your private interest mesh and you exchange. And so that way of thinking about the economy, that all the economy is about, a market economy or whatever happens in it, is all about private goods. So, we all get rich off of it, but really there's nothing shared, or there's nothing that would travel under the standard rubric of the common good in our economy, in our normal institutions. Maybe it happens in households or maybe it happens at the margins, but in the center, it's just all a giant vehicle of private interest. And the Chicago School that you just mentioned is... So the most famous figure is Milton Friedman, but there's a whole bunch of other figures who'd be well known within economics or law, like Richard Posner, Aaron Director, Friedrich Hayek's kind of a fellow traveler. They're the sort of the paradigm of that, of the dominant way of thinking. So the idea that all there is private interest. All there is contractual exchange. There's nothing else, or there's barely anything else, and really there shouldn't be anything else. So they're kind of the clearest example of people who say, what the economy is just a bunch of people exchanging for self-interest, but the invisible hand sort of meshes everything together, and it works out great. So it's like, it's only private interest, and that's fine. So that's the standard view, and that's the view that I want to trouble, to question, to enrich. I mean, it's certainly a large grain of truth in that view. I don't want to say it's totally false, but it's just partial. And so when you look hard, or as I've tried to do, look hard at major institutions in our economy. So the book has a chunk of 3 chapters on firms, business corporations, and other firms. Or in a different way, when you look at markets, if you look hard at them, you see there's something other than just private interest, just people looking out for number one and trying to get the best for themselves. There's also the things that I think you need to, in order to understand, you need to think about the logic of common good, which is the logic of people reasoning together, pursuing shared projects, having a shared identity. These kinds of things are actually also operative, not just in politics or in the church, but also in firms and in a different way in markets.
Sorry, I was muted. Can you say something, Mark, about the distinction between common good and common goods, because I do think like, and I think maybe you make the point in the book, but like I think most people out there agree like, okay, there is such a thing as a common good, but maybe there's a way to pursue that without any common goods. Is that, I mean, and could you unpack that a little bit? Because I think that's something that people need to hear.
Absolutely. So I think there's a big roadblock to using the term the common good in any kind of useful way. It gets used in a number of different ways. Certainly all over the Catholic tradition, it's there, and it's central. Leo the 13th in a document called Au milieu des sollicitudes, which is written to the French Church around 1900, says something like, "After God, the common good is the first and last law of society." Like he's clearly making a big deal out of it, but what could it possibly mean? I mean, the most common use is something like this very grand thing, which I think of as the common good in capital letters, which means something like it's roughly equivalent to the public good or the flourishing of everybody. There's a magisterial document that says it's the good of all persons and of the whole person. So it's like this maximally inclusive giant thing. So I think if I'm not saying that the common good can't mean that or it ever means that, but when you're referring to it in that sense, you're not really going to shed much light on any particular kind of institutions because, and everyone is in favor of the giant good, who's opposed to the good of everybody? Of course, then massive disagreements about what that means. So if you think of the common good in that sense, it's really not a very useful tool. So I think of common good as, I think if you want to use it usefully, both to understand the Catholic tradition and to understand institutions like firms and markets, you have to think of it as a specific kind of good. So it's an irreducibly shared good, or a relational good that you only get by cooperating with people in some kind of group or community, whether that's a family, a team, a firm, a local community or something like that. It's a good that either you have together or you don't have it at all. So, the team, either the whole team wins or the whole team loses. It's not like any particular players win or lose. Or the whole orchestra plays the symphony well, or the whole orchestra plays the symphony badly. Yeah, I guess a couple of them could play well, but, then they'd be like, well, I played well, but the horn section didn't. And so the symphony was a disaster. We sucked, So it's that kind of, so I think there's a qualitative distinction. A common good is not just a heap of aggregate goods, or say like, if everyone gets $100, then we have a common good. Not in the sense that I would like to mean it. So, so common good is really if you take it in this more specific sense, it's a kind of good, and you could say the giant common good, the common good in capital letters, is a good like this. But it's really much more easy to understand what the concept means if we sort of leave aside, the entire flourishing of America or China or the whole globe or the whole cosmos, and just think about common goods as a particular kind of good that people can pursue together or not. Again, as contrasted with private goods, which are the kind of thing that I can get and you cannot get, or we each get separately. So if we each have an exchange, you're happy to sell your car, I'm happy to buy your car. Great, we each got something out of it, but this is paradigmatically a heap or a bunch or an aggregation of private goods, not a common good. If, on the other hand, you could say, well, that we sold each other our car and then we started a relationship and it was good for our friendship, then you're bringing in some kind of note of common goods. So analytically, these things are separate. Like to say something is a private good or is to say it's different than a common good, operates on a different law. It's something that you can possess. It's something that you can trade and alienate. But in real life, these things are often kind of mixed together. So I mentioned in the book a story, a friend of mine, she was selling her house. She was moving and selling her house. She sold it to a guy who was a stranger, and like 2 years later, they got married. So, they started interacting because of the house, and then he asked her to, paint the house or go buy something. And there was a whole, because we're human beings, these things aren't necessarily separate in your life. So for them, the private good of he got the house he wanted, she got the price she wanted, ended up leading to, they formed a family and a relationship or whatever. So in real life, the borders are not sharp, but I think conceptually or analytically, we should keep them sharp. We should think of common goods as over there, private goods as over there, or at least as initially, and then we can try and once we have a clear idea of how they're different, then maybe we can combine them back together.
Interesting. I was talking to one of the principals of the school I used to work at. Her husband was a businessman out here in Krakow, and I remember the story that she told me that he's coming from England and doing some business in Poland, and one of his employees wanted to leave early because she was going to go have the house blessed by a priest, and her husband the business owner. He let her do it, but there was something really that he should have, in his mind, he shouldn't have done it. Because of the contract that was kind of between the two of them. And, this was all in the context I remember of one time, because I asked to kind of leave to go to, and take a couple of days off because of my father-in-law's, funeral. And, it was kind of like a way of saying, hey, I'm being very like humane here, but in some ways, according to business logic, this shouldn't fly. And I thought, that story kind of came to my mind as I was reading your book, because, I was thinking that, let's go back a little bit to maybe the Chicago School of Economics. Now, I don't want to come across like I know a ton about that school, and I may be getting it wrong. So correct me here if I'm wrong. But it seemed like, since it's kind of like you said, you talk about the business as kind of a nexus of contracts. There's a certain way of thinking, and also like that may be exclusively focused on profit. And that may lead to certain decisions, but it kind of excludes an entire, like you said, entire sphere of just human life that also may be part of the business and have to be taken into consideration. So, like, this is my question. I said that, like, the Chicago School and maybe this way of thinking about the economy has become, in a way, you said, the standard way of thinking. How has this changed us, like, as human beings, to say, well, hey, business is business, and all this other stuff, let's not think about this, or hey, I'm going to have to fire you because of this and this, but don't take it personally. And friendship, well, we'll act like we're friends, but really we're not. And I'm not even going to really call it like a friendship of utility. So,
good question. Yeah. So one of the most famous Chicago, I guess, doctrines is exactly what you were referring to. Is this something that goes back to Michael Jensen and William Meckling, 1976? They'd say, well, what is a business? So they're talking about trying to understand how businesses work or what businesses are. A business is just a nexus of contracts. So it's a bunch of people who are basically unrelated to each other, self-interestedly signing contracts with one another about what they're going to do and what they're not going to do. And there's really nothing more. So, and that would, so to say it's a contract. So if you're immersed in this world, you sort of hear some things when you say it's a contract. So say it's a contract means everyone is exactly equal, because normally in a contracting relationship, everyone is equal. It doesn't matter if you're a millionaire or whatever, like you sign the contract, you can't order someone to sign. It has to be free. So the contract is freely signed among equals, and it's basically it's more or less just concerned with my good. And also the contract is supposed to say exactly what I do. So, how many days off I have, or what my salary is. But, in reality, lots of things go on, especially in businesses or other kinds of cooperation, that are extra contractual. Like maybe you needed a few more days off than your contract said. And so you'd appeal to something like the spirit, either the humanity of the person or just the spirit of a school, or something like, hey, if you were in this situation, you'd want to have days off too. Yeah, which is a perfectly normal thing to do. But in the contract spirit, it would be something like, nope, your contract says this, and then you get exactly this many days off. And if these were the terms on which you agreed to take the job, and if you don't want the job on these terms, like, then you can leave. And so, but in real businesses, what happens is a lot of extra contractual stuff, either asking for a vacation, or your boss says, hey, we've got this big project, can you work some overtime? Or they'll appeal to something beyond what's in the contract. So you'll do more, they'll ask for more. There's a lot of things that go beyond. And when you go beyond, then you have to sort of appeal to either, hey, I did something for you previously, or some other kind of, basically it's the idea of there's a shared project here, or, the team really needs you to do this. And sometimes this is, I think, they're like, we're a family, we're a corporate family, or that we're brothers. Sometimes this is just, I think, manipulative claptrap. But in some businesses, or in many businesses, that's really part of the ethos of what's going on. Is there is a shared project, and people feel allegiance to it, and they're willing to do more. Of course, if you work more, hopefully you'll get somewhat compensated later on, So, but there's something more than just people who are completely indifferent to one another, just signing contracts and say, this is exactly what I'm going to do, and this is what I'm going to get out of it.
Can you, there are many places to go from there. I mean, I find myself just like wondering about some basic definitions. So you're getting into the kind of the contract stuff and businesses or whatever, but what is a corporation really? Like, you talk about corporations and firms and things like that, but these are words that are so prevalent in the media, and that we've just grown accustomed to them, like, oh, it's a corporation, or but what are these things? Like, they seem to have this sort of life, right? that demands a kind of oxygen or something. And I just find myself wondering, are we thinking of them the right way, or did we go wrong somewhere with the way these things operate in our society?
Good. Well, those several questions there, and that is a
Yeah.
very, I think, a fundamental question. Because in my view, if you want to talk about I would say you talk about, there are different common goods in different areas, maybe in business or in music or in families or whatever. But a key thing to ask is, like, we're talking common goods is attached to groups, but to understand what the common good of the group is, you have to know what is this group before we start invoking common, what is the thing? So the question, what is a firm or what is a corporation, I think is absolutely essential. So, and because if you define it in one way, if you define it in the Chicago way, common goods essentially disappear. And if you define it in, I think, a more realistic way, they appear, or at least they're possible. So the Chicago definition of what a firm is, as I said, just a nexus of contracts. It's just a kind of a little corner of the market. Some people buy things on the stock market, and some people buy things in the used car market. And a firm is just a kind of particularly intricate market where people are exchanging labor and capital goods and various other kinds of things. So so they understand we have to define, in order to get our conclusions, we have to define the firm or the corporation in a particular way. So they do. And I like the Chicago school insofar as I think their conclusions, they're going to say the firm is just a bunch of contracts, and then down the road, what they're going to conclude is it's all about profit. And I think if they were right about what the firm is, they would be right that firms are all about profit. But they're wrong. So they're wrong about what it is. I mean, you could appeal to, say, magisterial authority. So John Paul II in Centesimus Annus defines the business enterprise generally as a community of persons at the service of society. But you don't need to appeal to. So I think he's right, but I wouldn't say you shouldn't believe that because the Pope said it. You should say it because that's what firms actually are. So now to go a little bit more. So I think of a firm as just an association of persons kind of doing business type stuff. So when you say a firm, that's what I'm meaning. People and things working together in a business with a name. It could be Honda, it could be the local grocery store or whatever. A corporation, on the other hand, we use those as though a corporation is a kind of thing. Corporations are fairly intricate, and I admit not everyone agrees with me about what they are. So a lot of the debate's going to be about what are these things really anyway. So a corporation is normally we think of it as a kind of business, but really what it is a way of governing a business. So technically, a corporation, or as a corporate person, the law makes up this special person called, Honda Incorporated, and all the stuff that Honda does is technically owned by, all the contracts that signs are signed by Honda Incorporated. So you can govern a firm. Basically, the difference is you can govern a firm as it's, Andrew's firm, Andrew's barbershop, or I use a pie company in the book as an example. If it's Andrew's barbershop, then everything that the firm does is kind of ultimately what Andrew's doing. You sign the contract with the employees, you sell the things. If you cause a problem, you're going to get sued, and et cetera. So that would be like a sole proprietorship. You own the firm. You own the stuff, you sign the contracts. With the corporation, what happens is that the corporation itself owns the firm. So Honda owns the stuff. Honda signs the contracts. And you could say, well, isn't it actually Honda's shareholders or maybe Honda's board? And my argument would be, no, it's not. The way the law works is they're creating this special legal person, which comes from Roman law and is very present in canon law too. The idea of a corporate person. So a religious order, it could be a corporate person. A diocese is a corporate person. I don't know if the church herself is a corporate person, but it's like this thing that owns the stuff, that bears the liability, et cetera. So I'd say a firm is like people working together, and some firms are corporate firms in the sense that they are governed by a corporation. If you pay the money to incorporate, now you're, Andrew's Barbershop Incorporated, and technically you don't own the firm anymore, but Andrew's, this corporate person owns it. Andrew Inc. owns it, and you just are the chairman of the board or something like this. So this can be a little, these distinctions can, like, depending on how far down into the nitty gritty you guys want to go, these distinctions can be pretty important. But go ahead and
But
ask me if that sparked any thoughts.
Andrew, I mean, do you have a follow up to that?
No, take it, Bobby.
I'm just curious. I mean, I think you touch upon this a little bit in the book. You said it comes out of Roman law, then ecclesial law. I'm thinking about, religious organizations. But when does a corporation get applied to, like, and I forget the distinction, how you talk about the relationship between a firm and corporation, but when does it get applied to this kind of business, the business world as we think of it today?
Right. So again, the distinction is basically a firm is in my view, it's the actual people working together in a business. You just call that a firm. Some firms are corporations if they have incorporated and they have a board of directors and such, and some firms are not. They're owned. So corporations have to do with governance, power and governance, like who makes the decisions, who technically is signing the contracts. If it's you or it's some individual, it's a partnership. That's a bunch of people who are bearing the liability and signing everything. So when does it happen? Well, again, the corporate form, generally speaking, goes very back. It goes back to the church. Many of the U.S. colonies, when they were originally colonized, were corporations. They were kind of a self-governing corporation. It doesn't really come into the business world until the later 19th century. And initially, the corporation, the law would say to be a corporation is to be a privilege. Like only a special few people get to be a corporation because you get limited liability. You have these other privileges of being of not, so if you screw up in your corporation, you aren't necessarily going to be personally bankrupted because the corporation might go out of business, but your personal assets are not at stake. So this is great. Initially in the sort of Western U.S. context in the early 19th century, the only things that could be corporations were generally big public ventures, again, like a colony, or once we started building railroads or canals, they needed to be very big. So corporations are very good at raising money because I'm not giving money to Andrew personally, and I'm giving money to the corporation. So if Andrew dies or runs off with somebody or whatever, the corporation continues. So there's lower risk. They can have many stockholders. So initially, they were used for these very large things in the early 19th century. And by the later 19th century, basically the history is that it turns out that people thought this was a pretty cool way of doing business, especially when you wanted to do business at large scale. So you're thinking the era of Standard Oil, the era of J.P. Morgan. They wanted to do bigger and bigger businesses. Corporations are really useful for that. So in the later 19th century, suddenly any business can become, basically any business can become a corporation if it wants to. You have to file you don't have to ask the king or Congress to become a corporation. You just go down to the Secretary of State or something and you incorporate, and there you go.
Let me ask you about then another word. So we've talked about corporations and firms. I wonder if we could talk now about markets a little bit, because that's the area for me that seems the most like a kind of witchcraft or something. I mean, I can sort of understand the idea of a firm and a corporation according to like what you've described. But let me read you one quote from your book. You talk about how let me see if I can find it here. I apologize, listeners and viewers. You say, okay, in the midst of quite a long discussion, so excuse me for just simplifying this or just pulling something out of context, but you say, the bluntest way to express the normative distinction is to note, when you're talking about businesses and markets, I guess, the bluntest way to express the normative distinction is to note that businesses aim at common goods while markets do not. So that to me, am I crazy that like that's a very... that's a very like important thing to acknowledge if it's true, Mark, because, markets are just, it just seems to be the way everything is constructed. Everything's about markets, and yet if we're lacking this sort of end for them, that seems, again, I'm not really an expert. To say I'm not really an expert is the most ridiculous understatement. I don't really know what I'm talking about here, but I want to know more because there's a lot of us are living with this sort of feeling of unease that it isn't just like, okay, this company sells something I want, so I'm going to take my money there, or this person is someone I trust and I'm going to do business with. Rather that there's this whole kind of world behind the scenes that's governing all this stuff that I have no say in and no control over, So I take it from there, Mark. Tell me if I'm crazy or not, or clarify for us.
Well, and just to pick up on the last point you said, many advocates of markets would say, One of the best things about markets is that you don't have any say in them. In fact, and in their it's sort of an idealized view, nobody has a say in them. Because if you contrast a market, so you could have a world in which nobody is in charge, everyone's just kind of at the whims of the market, as against the lord of the manor is in charge or the dictator is in charge, and we're all subject to him. So partisans of markets would say, among other things, markets are not only good because they tend to be good coordinators and help us get rich, or help things be more efficient. Also, they free us from being under the thumb of other people. So it could, if you were a serf in 18th century Russia, you'd know who's in charge. There would be a pretty clear hierarchy going up to the czar of who's in charge. Whereas in a market, you're kind of like, nobody seems to be in charge. And ideally, that's right. Nobody is in charge. So now about the quote you gave, I mean, I think this is the sort of fundamental distinction I would like people to get. Essentially, common goods only come from cooperation or in a community, or common action in a community. A firm is a kind of a community. People are acting together all the time. They know each other. They're giving orders. They're blah, 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 blah. A market is just, so a firm is aiming at a kind of cooperative good. Like we're trying to succeed as Honda or as the bakery or the barbershop or whatever. Where a market is not that kind of thing at all. It's not a kind of community. It's a vast network of people, perhaps. It may benefit people, again, in their private goods. I mean, what we say the market as though it's somehow parallel to the corporation, but really they're very opposite. Like a market is kind of a indefinitely network of buyers and sellers who are coordinated by prices, who want to buy things. But they do not, even when when it goes great and let's say everyone makes money, that doesn't make it a community, and that money is not a kind of a common good. So again, that doesn't mean it's bad. I think private goods are good. It's fine and markets are indispensable in terms of large scale coordination. So we couldn't have a world without markets. But markets are just not oriented to any particular kind of common good, i.e., that this enterprise should succeed, or even that this country should succeed. You read about sort of large scale political economy. Countries are doing great, and then something happens. Trends change, and the whole this whole national economy is laid in ruins. The market itself doesn't care, because in a way, how could it care? It's just a network of people buying and selling stuff. So as long as it's just a bunch of individuals saying, I'm going to buy the things I want, and I'm not thinking about the other people in the market, or I'm not thinking about accomplishing some big goal, that America should become rich. Like, how would I even accomplish that via the market? So Adam Smith is a very famous or a famous quote that I like to point out. He says, "I've never found it much good for when merchants trade for the public good." He basically says it's kind of useless and harmful when people pretend to go out in the market and promote the common good. What they really ought to do is just do their business well and kind of let the invisible hand coordinate the rest of it. So I think that's expressing a pretty deep truth about markets, at least markets on the standard model. So, which isn't always right, but this is a true thing about markets. It's just people going and buying, selling things. And so all the good that they do does not add up to even a good functioning market. We should be glad it's there, but it doesn't directly promote any common good, in the sense that you'd have to step back and say, the market is doing this, and that's been great for my hometown. It's been great for this, the Catholic education space. It's been great for the church or something like that, because now they have resources to do all this other stuff. So you could say the market isn't bad. It just gives resources to various communities to accomplish their common goods. But in my view, what the market itself does is not anything like promote a common good. It's not aimed at any particular common good. It doesn't either realize it or frustrate it, because it's just not the right kind of thing.
And just to follow up, Mark, I mean, would you agree that there's just a kind of general consensus in the United States, at least, that it's like we either can't or shouldn't control it? Like, I mean, it just is a thing, it just is out there. And I mean, I'm thinking back to like the financial crisis in 2008, where it's like, at least it occurred to me at that time. And I was, I don't know how old I was then. I was in my late 20s, I guess, or mid to late 20s. And I didn't really have distinct opinions about any of these things then. But it did kind of seem to me at the time where I kind of stepped back and I thought, gosh, I mean, it seems like there's a whole lot of unreality about the market. I mean, it seems like, this failure is the result of like a value assigned, like things had value that weren't real, like, which to me is just a very strange way. Like, I mean, there's no way it's going to achieve some kind of common good if that's baked into it. Maybe that's just a kind of rant and you don't have to respond to it, but just that came to mind as I was reading your book.
Well, again, I think one way a little bit with the deflationists, or sometimes at least with the deflationists when it comes to market. Like the market didn't fail to achieve its common good at the financial crisis. Markets don't have common goods. Like they don't know. They're somehow, people talk about them in many ways, but they somehow bring together all the information that people have and they coordinate people. And turns out a bunch of that information was lies and illusion, at that time. But and the market eventually showed that. And once those investments went bad, the value of those investments in those firms crashed. And but that wasn't, I guess you could say, that was the market working as much as it failing. But really, markets aren't really oriented towards any kind of good. They're just a coordination device that people use. And that's especially true if you think of markets as what I characterize in the book as strangers selling stuff. This is basically, markets are just a bunch of people who are sort of impersonally, indifferently, anonymously trading with each other, trying to get a good deal, but again, not trying to accomplish anything in particular. So I'd be just as ready to trade with someone from China or Zaire as I am for trade with my neighbor, as long as they're offering me the best deal. And the more you think about markets in that terms, the less they look like they're supposed to be. You could say, the market really served the common good or not. They're just kind of out there. Now, what I do, I guess, in the later chapters of the book, and some of, I think, the more challenging, interesting parts is, well, we don't have to. There is that only captures part of the picture of what markets are. I mean, markets are sustained by merchants who are just trying to, trading at arm's length and trying to get their best deal. But there's also other things that go into markets. There's all sorts of cultural factors. There's, political, there's regulation that comes from politics and other places, and that helps. So maybe part of what you were seeing in the 2008 crisis, for example, was failures of regulation of various kinds. Or either they changed the laws about what banks were allowed to invest in. The ratings agencies, which are supposed to tell investors how creditworthy investments are, they got kind of either lazy or hoodwinked or possibly corrupt or something. So they were saying things were good investments and they're actually bad investments. So there's a number of failures there that you'd think, well, that's not the market was failing to do what it was intended to do or created to do, either transmit good information, allow people to make decisions on that basis. So the more you can bring in more of that kind of stuff, and the more you bring in, I think, what I think of as the social or political frame, the more you could say, the market is trying to promote some kind of shared project, but not quite in the same way. It's not like everyone in the market is a big family or it's like the members of a nation, because it's pretty much, or in an important way, they sort of meet as strangers or just as individuals.
Interesting. Yeah, you mentioned the later part of your book, in which you go into Hayek, Polanyi, and then the Italian school.
Mm-hmm.
And just to kind of, you mentioned that the market may work at a certain way when you're talking about it globally. But can you maybe explain, for some of our viewers, can you get into some of those theorists like Hayek, Polanyi, and then the Italian school? Because I'm sure a lot of people, first of all, will, be interested, because this is the podcast. I was talking to Andrew about, Caritas and Veritate, and a little bit of the debate about that. And this is a podcast named after Pope
Mm-hmm.
Benedict. And I remember when that came out years ago, seeing a couple articles about these Italian economists and how they think about the economy, and maybe some of that plays a role in that encyclical. So I'm sure some more people who are big Pope Benedict fans will find some of this stuff interesting.
Good, yeah. So in the final chapter of the book, I talk about the civil economists. So Stefano Zamagni and Luigino Bruni are the biggest names in that school. And to my mind, the most interesting paragraphs of Caritas and Veritate, Benedict's encyclical of 2005, were written or ghost-written or heavily influenced by them, about gratuitousness and communion and solidarity in the market. This is exactly the kind of thing I would say. But sort of to understand like why their position is interesting and distinctive, you have to understand a little bit about what the standard view is. And I think that, again, the standard view of buying and selling is just that, again, people meet as strangers selling stuff, and so we're each trying to get a good deal among ourselves. And so if all we're trying to do is that, I think that doesn't produce any common goods per se. You can get rich and you can benefit your community, and I can benefit my community, but the market itself or the actual exchange doesn't constitute any kind of common good. But if you really want to understand what's going on in the market in the sort of capital letter big sense, you also have to ask a bit about the the frame of the market, or what's around it, or what helps it to go. What are those regulatory structures or cultural structures? So in the first part of that section, I talk about Friedrich Hayek. Well, I think if you haven't read Hayek, he's well worth reading. I mean, I often disagree with him, but he's very clear, he's very insightful, and he follows the implications of his sort of core ideas really far. So he's very helpful to read. He's sort of a devout opponent of common good. So I don't, and I'm a proponent of them, I guess. But he's a very clear thinker, though. So Hayek's view is that not only is it the case that when you and I are buying and selling on Amazon or whatever, we're doing sort of just impersonal exchange, just about private goods. His view is also, the world around that, the political world and the cultural world, is also just a matter of basically the same kind of thing. So when he thinks about politics or law, he thinks, well, it's also a spontaneous order where people are just trying to coordinate their individual goods. So in politics, he's sort of an ultra liberal or a classical liberal or libertarian or something along those lines, because he thinks that politics is simply about private goods as well. People want to benefit themselves in the market, and he applies essentially the same model to politics. And then so he could say my sort of liberal capitalist world, has no common good. The concept of the common good maybe applies to your private life or your family, but other than that, not so much. So again, I think if he was right about the way politics works, that conclusion would follow, because I think he's right to say, like, if you want to find common goods or talk about a common good, you have to know whose good it is. What community is it the good? So if there are no common goods in politics and there are no common goods in exchange, then there just aren't any common goods on the scene at all. And again, that's a perfectly coherent proposal. I think he's generally mistaken about the way politics works and the way markets are founded, but it's well worth, if you want to understand the logic of the thing, it's well worth engaging with him. And he's also very clear on the benefits of markets. Even if this is the case, markets are a great way to coordinate among people who don't necessarily agree, because they don't necessarily have any contact with each other. We can trade with people on the other side of the world, and we can benefit one another just by trading. And that's a great benefit of markets. So we shouldn't undersell that kind of thing. So basically the idea there, again, is that there's no common goods in exchange, and there's no common goods in politics either. Now, I turn to it in another chapter, which I think is my favorite chapter of the book. I talk about a mid-century theorist named Karl Polanyi, who maybe you heard of. His famous book is called The Great Transformation. And he basically agrees with Hayek in the extent that, markets and buyers and sellers and merchants, they're pretty much just engaged in some kind of self-interested exchange. But he wants to ask, well, where do markets come from? Why is it they're even available? There are prices for things for you to buy and prices for you to pay. Because if you look at, he has a strong anthropologist kind of streak. So if you look at human societies more than 1,000 years ago, most of them had no markets. People weren't buying and selling things. They were just doing things for their uncle and their brother, and there's these complicated economies of custom and tradition. And so he says, well, what we have that's different is this space of exchange where people just buy and sell. That's very different. That's kind of unnatural, or at least historically new. Where did it come from? It came from it had to be sort of set on foot. It was a kind of a political project. So he says, well, markets have to be set on foot by a concerted project. So you don't get markets until you have political people or political actors, communities, countries that are interested in them, that support them, that regulate them appropriately, etc. So in his view, you have, or the way I interpret it anyway, you have common goods at the level of politics or at the level of countries, at the level of in the frame of the market, even though the market itself is still kind of just strangers selling stuff. And that's interesting, because then you have, when you and I buy things, it may just be a matter of private goods, but there is the market itself as a big system is associated with our shared ideas about what it means to be a human being, or what do we want a society to look like. So it invokes these big things. Hayek thinks it doesn't, because he thinks those things are just off the table entirely. Anyway, so Polanyi, and this is, I think, in a way this is quite unfamiliar to most of us. All right, in reading Polanyi, I think we can see how the market does advance a kind of a vision of the common good, not necessarily in each transaction when you and I buy and sell things, but saying, like, we want to live in a world in which there are markets, in which people are free to to use their property, and but then so markets advance the common good in this sort of second order sense. Not each particular transaction, but the fact that there are markets and the fact that there is a labor market or other kinds of things. This reflects some vision of the common good. And Thirdly, so to get back to who I was, Caritas and Veritate, or the Italian civil economists, they say, wait a minute, you're telling me that every time anyone goes on the market, they're just thinking about themselves, they're just trying to get a good deal. Hang on, that's not how markets are, or maybe that's not how they should be. So the way I understand the civil economists who talk, they say people are not, naturally atomistic. They're naturally friends with each other, or friendly, or they have all these social instincts as well. They say, well, so what you see in a market is actually not a form of self-interest, but a particular form of fraternity. So in their view, markets in their essence, or when people are buying and selling, we could say, oh, that's actually a form of promoting a kind of common good, or a way of common good thinking, because the buyer says, I want to do something good for you. And the other guy says, I want to do something good for you. And they sort of enter into this, not just arm's length, like, how do I get the most possible out of this, but like, let's do something together. So that perspective, the idea that we can see markets in terms of a richer, cooperative, common good type thinking, that's what's reflected in Caritas and Veritate when it says solidarity and gratuitousness and the spirit of the gift need to be right in the middle of economic activity, not just elsewhere and outside or elsewhere.
Yeah, go ahead,
No,
Bobby.
no. I was just gonna. In your book, you say you're not kind of endeavoring to, plot out like a normative project. You're not on you don't have a normative mission in this book, but you're descriptive, and you say that, like, okay, with thinking about common goods and this kind of the latter the Italian school that you were talking about, you're kind of describing. You say you're just describing what businesses are. And helping them think a little bit better about that. Is that the way you described your project in this book?
I mean, yes, I foreground the descriptive part. So I think rather than just saying everybody ought to promote the common good, which is in a certain sense right, I do start with the descriptive and say, let's think harder about what's actually going on. And then we can see that this sort of common good thinking all makes sense. It helps us to understand what we're already doing. So my view of sort of teleology is that, and if you think of anything as having an end, it's sort of that explains how it works and how it's supposed to work. The tree is sort of trying to become, the acorn is trying to become a big tree, and that's good for the tree. So you see its ends, and to be successful is to realize the ends that you already have. So on that same kind of thing, that same kind of thought, if we can show that firms, business, corporate firms, or other kinds of firms are oriented towards a cooperative, common good type project in the way they actually work, then it'll be more plausible to say, hey, you guys need to think in terms of a common good, and you could experience this as a form of communion, rather than that. So then it doesn't sound like some moral that's coming out of left field, or some church person saying, like, you ought to be not self-interested. And they'll say, well, you just don't understand how business works. I would say, well, if business actually works that way, then we have a better leg to stand on in saying you ought to promote the common good here. So that's where I begin. So I do want people to, I do have a normative project or a normative interest in people saying, I would like to promote the common good. But I think if we want to understand what that could mean and to make it more persuasive, if we could describe the world as already incorporating common good reasoning or orientation towards shared goods, common ends, then this will sound less like utopia and more like, oh, this is a good way of describing our economy, which frankly already functions pretty well. So if I say, like, the economy is all about self-interest, and I've got this other proposal, like, that just makes me sound like a utopian weirdo. But I can say, I would like to be able to say there's common good already, or common goals and common action built into the economy in ways that you're not seeing because of the way you're thinking about it, but they're really there. Then I think the distance between saying, hey, let's have an economy for the common good is not as great.
It makes me think, Mark, that you mentioned before John Paul II, Centesimus Annus, and we've been talking about some of these other, church documents and that sort of thing. It's something that Bobby and I talk about a lot, is just how we really want to focus people's attention on kind of the descriptive, like, vocation of the church more than prescriptive, right? The church isn't just like thumping big, like creating these big books and thumping them down on tables and saying, this is what we declare, make your peace with it, like that kind of thing. Rather, the church is describing reality, right? And so I think when we dig down the way you're doing, it makes for me, it makes something like the invisible hand seem quite theoretical and prescriptive rather than descriptive, whereas like when you start talking about the common good, you're just talking about the basic way humans live. And we want an economy, I suppose, that is reflective of that rather than sort of trying to apply some theory to humanity that may be ultimately quite dehumanizing. I don't know whether you agree with that or not, but that
Well,
came
and
to my mind.
there's a common narrative out there, which I would resist, which is again says something like, self-interest is what humans really are. And we're being realistic when we say they're just out for number one all the time.
Right.
And all that altruism, common goody stuff, you can say about how they should be, but you don't understand how the world is. I would say false. Self-interest. I mean, there are forms of vice and sin and self-interest, sure, but humans do lots of things that are not for self-interest. And so it's the one who says it's all self-interest. They're, I think, more as ideological or more than the person who says we're aiming at the common good, because people are frequently, they do all sorts of things together. They value being together. That is part of what makes an economy go. And to deny that isn't realism. It's a kind of, as you say, it's like an excessive amount of theory. Like, again, a bit of theory is great. I'm a theorist. I love theory. But if your theory is supposed to explain the data, not tell the data what it's supposed to, not say,
Right.
well, that doesn't agree with the data, therefore, so much the worse for the world. Like, no, so much the worse for your theory. If people are not as self-interested as you say they are, that means you have a bad theory. Not that the world ought to be more, not the world ought to be more self-interested, and then it would be better.
Yeah. If I could just follow up on one more thing, you mentioned kind of the I don't know if it's a concern or an accusation or whatever of being a kind of utopian dreamer when you start sort of talking about common good or common goods. And I think our conversation today is timely because, every few months or so there kind of erupts, whether it's on Twitter or somewhere, this sort of like debate among people, I guess, particularly on the right over some of these questions,
Right.
and it does seem to be that there's a certain group out there that as soon as you raise the question of common good, that in their eyes you might as well go be an advisor for Mayor Mamdani and or something like that, right? I mean, it really is like. It really does seem to be in some people's hearts almost a kind of betrayal of the American way, or like a kind of, and I just wonder, is that due to just the kind of intellectual success of the Chicago school, or is that like, how did that, how did we get where we are, where, these debates then create such tension?
Well, I think the short answer to your proposal is yes. The reflexive opposition essentially is a product of the classical liberal / libertarian right. So you talk to someone who's a convinced libertarian, they will say, basically, there's no such thing as a common good, and therefore anybody who appeals to a common good is a closet, whatever you want to call them, communist, totalitarian, etc. That because and that's sort of a doctrine of their school, is there's no such thing as a common good. So that because they have this is a very hard, all there is private goods, all there is individual rights, the rest of the stuff is bad, is either lies or bad. And of course, I don't think this isn't actually the tradition on which America was built. I mean, I would, for example, you read John Locke, arguably the kind of most influential political philosopher on the American founding. He talks about virtue and the public good and the common good. I mean, he doesn't make a ton of them, but he's at least comfortable with the idea that there is such a thing, or that maybe it matters somehow. So there's a certain kind of right-wing discourse that has gone away from that sort of older liberal founding tradition and to a more economics focused sort of Chicago school thing, where they'd say like there's just no such thing as the common good. I've been to events where I've talked to people who are associated with this kind of institution. They're like, is there such a thing? And like with a great deal of suspicion, like either you're wicked or like you're a closet wicked person, or you're an idiot for thinking there's a common good. And the reason, and this is sort of something McIntyre points out, like, or parallel to something he says, the reason the common good language comes up recurrently is because it's actually necessary for understanding certain features of the world. Like people actually do act for common goods, and it's very hard to the idea that everything is just about private rights and private good. Like this is just a feature of normal human life. It's not like a highly esoteric thing that you have to be a PhD in political theory to have any idea. So people will find themselves appealing to something like this because it's just I think this is a concept that gives a name to something that's in human life. Yeah, and I think well, to go back to your previous question, which I didn't respond to, about the church being, I think we should give the church more credit as a sort of, again, as a kind of descriptive, of a describer of the way human nature is, uh, as well as a mission of saying how she ought to be. Because again, if you have a sort of teleological view or an idea that humans are created for goodness, they're oriented towards God, then of course you're gonna see that orientation and their ethics or something like this in the way they act, and therefore so if you want to describe the world properly, well, before you can say this is how it ought to be, you need to describe the world properly. So I think Catholics tend to have a fairly unique vision of how things actually work, in addition to a proposal for how they ought to work better.
Yeah, maybe on the common good stuff in the book, you elaborate on the difference between kind of a Thomistic approach to the common good and more. I mean, you say the Augustinian or Thomistic and a more Aristotelian approach. Can you, for people who are unfamiliar with that, could you elaborate on that?
Right. So here we're just talking about, this is abstracting from the economy, but just on the very concept of common good. So um, this sort of marks out the opposite. Maybe you could say this marks out the opposite pole from what Andrew was just referring to. There are some people who would deny that the common good, there's any kind of common good, but there's another sort of like person maybe on the post-liberal or traditionalistic right or something like that. They would take a vision of the common good that was usually explicitly influenced by Aquinas, and I love Thomas as much as the next guy, but the one, this tends to be a very grand, sort of highly sort of universalistic and normative thing. So the common good is all about kind of like universal harmony, even possibly in the whole cosmos, with everything working together under God. Or maybe if you zoom down into a city, like all the citizens forming, having a form of civic friendship that's oriented towards virtue and living a good life together, and that's what the common good is. So, and again, as a sort of an ideal, I'm not opposed to that, and I love Thomas Aquinas, but I see, if you look at the way Aristotle uses it, people also say Aristotle agrees with Thomas about this. I'm not so sure. At least Aristotle was a lot more alive to the realities of power, of conflict in ordinary institutions. So if you read his Politics, it's all about basically tussles between the rich and the poor, trying to gain superiority within a city. And he said, even in the midst of this tussles, leaving aside perfect virtue and ideal harmony, which we're never going to get to in a world of both sin and ignorance and limits, he says you can realize a common good. There's a common good that's possible there, and in a sense is already present. So I take the Aristotelian thing to be, or when I think of myself, if you're distinguishing between Aristotle and Thomas, like the common good does not necessarily point us to ideal harmonies, but it points us to how people are coordinating and with people they disagree with, and how are they exercising power over one another, and is that legitimate? Is it taken to be legitimate? So I would like the common good to be able to deal with the kind of fallen ordinary human institutions, rather than just being a big ideal to which we aspire. Because I think if it's just a big ideal, there's not a lot you can say about it, and it doesn't help you understand. It certainly doesn't help you understand markets or corporations. Because then you'd say, well, any good market is a market that promotes the common good. Well, what does that? I don't know. You fill in your favorite version of the economy or your favorite political party, and you say, well, that's for the common good. So I think I like to start with, again, a closer in description of or understanding of how these things actually work, and seeing, hey, it looks like people are cooperating for a shared end here, or they're not. And therefore you can say something more about whether the logic of common good is relevant or maybe not.
Yeah, you talk somewhere in the book, Mark, maybe I think it's pretty early on, about how, please correct me if I'm getting your analogy wrong, but how you want to make this point by like taking the engine out of the car so that it isn't sort of, I'm forgetting now what it is, but it's something like you want to help us see the workings without without the body, as it were, that might, maybe that's the body of a political party, or the body of like something that we usually kind of confuse, or we get kind of distracted by the workings. Is that right? Am I getting that right?
Yes, right. So I use that analogy, and I think it's sort of helpful about what I'm aiming at in the book, which is common good, and normally refers to this sort of whole project of a politics of virtue oriented around all this sort of, so it's got a, I say, well, that's like the whole car of, team common good is operating their race car, and that's where they're trying to get to, the sort of politics of virtue that you could associate with, I'm not sure, post-liberals or certain kind of Aristotelian influenced people. What I'd say is, well, I'm interested in the engine of the car, and the engine of the car, not the whole car. I'm not necessarily trying to drive where they're trying to drive. But I want the thing that drives their vehicle is the distinction between common goods and private goods. I think 'Cause that's where if common good is an interesting idea and a useful idea, and not just sort of a pie in the sky, or at least a massive normative vision, it's this distinction between common and private goods and the way they work. So that's what I call the engine of the car. And my analogy was, well, I'm not trying to drive with them. So you might not like where they're trying to go. That's fine. You can still use the engine of the car. In fact, everyone should use the engine of the car because it just helps us to understand how businesses work and how markets work. And so even if you I say you could be a common good progressive. You could be a common good anarchist just because you use some of this idea of how the logic of common good and the logic of private goods. And that's what I'm trying to do is I'm like, I don't make a proposal here for what the good corporation is or what the good market is. I try and use this idea of common good to say, like, let's understand how corporations actually work and see where there's some openings for common good thinking. You need to fill those in with, what you think about the nature of man, or what you think about the flourishing community or justice. Common good, is open to those things, but the idea of common good doesn't tell you what you ought to think about all those things. Those are just separate questions. And usually talk about the common good, I think, is defeated by over big aspirations that, it includes somehow everything. Like, no, it's a specific idea that gets at the difference between cooperating as a member of a community and being a sort of separate individuals exchanging, helps us understand that. And that's really helpful for understanding the economy. But if you wanted to answer every question, it won't end up answering any of them, at least not very well.
Mark, kind of to wrap things up here, I heard in a previous podcast that you did that there was this question that was coming up the whole entire time you were writing this book, and now your next book, you're devoting it to that question. So I didn't catch that exactly in the podcast what that was, but could you, for people who are interested in your work, well, what are you working on now?
Well, I've got several different streams of things. Possibly my agenda has changed since then. I think in this book, what I've tried to do is apply the idea of common good to the market, or to the market economy. But I still think there's significant work that needs to be done in explaining how to use the idea of common good in general, because it applies to lots of other things. And as I mentioned, it's really essential to the Catholic intellectual tradition. So probably what I was referring to there was a project, of writing a kind of more systematic account of how to use the common good well, how to think about it, and how it's related to big issues of philosophy or big issues of social theory. So that's one stream of my work is just thinking about common goods and how to best think about them wherever they might appear. So I think on the advice of I'm still a pretty junior faculty member. So on the advice of some of my advisors, I think I've switched my next project to being more like an extension of this kind of thinking. I now work in a business school, so maybe after I get tenure, I will be able to sort of talk about the big philosophical questions. I think I'm going to end up working on another project related to how markets specifically, which we normally think of as the least amenable to common good thinking or to, solidarity and these sorts of considerations, or the logic of the gift, if you like, from Caritas and Veritate, how they actually do reflect that. So that's picking up on some of the chapters of this book, showing how, like, wait a minute, there might be more going on in the market than just stranger selling stuff. So I think that's going to be the next major project, but I have an important stream of my of articles and other things, and hopefully a book, maybe the next book after the next one, will be about let's see if we can just think more clearly about the common good in general, because it's an idea that I think is essential, but really needs more, I think, depth and clarity about how it's supposed to work if it's going to serve the function that the church and the world need it to serve.
Well, for now, we really hope people will check out your current book, The Price of the Common Good, Markets, Corporations, and Political Economy. Bobby and I both really enjoyed it. I myself am probably even less than Bobby. I don't know. I don't want to speak for you, Bobby, but I myself am a bit of a dolt when it comes to economics, and I learned a lot reading your book, and thank you for humoring us with our kind of rambling reflections and kind of putting you on the hot seat as a professional talking about these matters. But we've really enjoyed having you as a guest on our show today.
Thanks very much for having me. I wrote the book, or I tried to write it in such a way that ordinary non-specialists could get something out of it. I don't know. We'll let people read it, and hopefully I did succeed for them.
Indeed, we'll definitely put a link when we post this and we wish you every success in your position at Notre Dame and in all your publishing. Our guest today has been Mark Hoipkemier of the University of Notre Dame. Again, his book is called The Price of the Common Good, Markets, Corporations, and Political Economy. To all of our listeners and viewers, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, for supporting our work. Be sure to check out our website, spacesalviinstitute.com. Click on the donate button if you want to contribute to the work that we're doing. Be sure that you're liking and subscribing to and sharing the episodes that we put up for you. And again, please do leave us a comment or ask us a question on the YouTube channel, because that helps draw attention to our episodes. So for now, we'll sign off, and we encourage all of you to live in hope.